I am Anna Seawolf, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. Today's guest is Ann Cushman. She is a long-time yoga and meditation teacher whose writing has been published in the New York Times, O Magazine, Lion's Roar, and more. She teaches at Spirit Rock, Kripalu, and other venues worldwide, and she's the former editor of Yoga Journal and Tricycle, and she's the author of several books, including Moving into Meditation and the novel Enlightenment for Idiots. And we'll be talking about her new book, Mama Sutra, a story of love, loss, and the path of motherhood. Sutra is the Sanskrit name for a short spiritual teaching. This is a beautifully written memoir, and it's very moving. Tara Brach, the author of True Refuge and Radical Acceptance, has written a blurb for this book, and this is what she said. In this beautifully written and self-revealing book, Ann Cushman shows us how motherhood carries us into the heart of the spiritual journey. The key is realizing that the messy, imperfect moments are not a problem. They are the very grounds of the path. Please give yourself and others with the Mama Sutra. It's deeply engaging and fresh, poignant and wise. So well said. The book Mama Sutra spans an 18-year journey through motherhood as a spiritual practice, chronicling Ann's first pregnancy, her daughter's tragic stillbirth, the joyful birth of her son, the home retreat of early motherhood, the challenges of parenthood, the diagnosis and gifts of her son's developmental differences, the meltdown of her nuclear family, and its reconfiguration into a new and joyful form, and so much more. This is a powerful story of the rawness and beauty of life. And now, please enjoy this moving conversation with Ann Cushman. So, Ann, welcome to Authentic Parenting.
It's great to be here, Anna.
I know. After our failed attempt yesterday with technology, we're doing this again. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for being so kind and generous with your time.
Well, I'm happy to be here. And that's actually part of the meditative approach to life, is that sometimes you have to pause and say, that didn't work. Why don't we try it again?
I know. I absolutely adore your book. I am so touched and moved by the stories, by your humor, the insights and the depth of your thought pattern and your feelings. It's just a phenomenal book. So congratulations. And what does it mean to you to have this book in the world? I know you have worked on it for years, right?
I've worked on it off and on for many years, and I finally just said to myself, it was like a block in the creative pipeline. I just needed to move it out into the world. And it really is a feeling of beautiful completion for me. I sent in the manuscript to my editor, the first draft of the finished manuscript, shortly before my son graduated from high school. And then I made the revisions right as he started his first year in college. And this is on a book that I started writing well before he was born, when I was pregnant with my first child. So the arc of writing the book has really accompanied the entire journey of my path through motherhood. And so to have my son moving out into the world and the book moving out into the world at the same time is a really beautiful thing.
Yeah, it's sort of like this metaphorical think, and I'm thinking, right now that you're in a completely different place in your motherhood journey, your child is not a child anymore. I guess he will always be your child, right? But he's an adult, but you sort of are done with the mundane parenting aspect of parenting. And so, sort of that completion, I see this parallel with the book. I don't know what I'm saying, but it's for me, it has this, meaning to it.
Yes, and writing is really a way of digesting an experience and making sense of it. So it was a beautiful way. Of course, I've been taking notes. The book is drawn on journal notes and essays and things that I had written over, many, many, many years. But in putting it all together, there's a way you go back, you make sense of things, and you get to really step back and see the big arc of the story, which you sometimes can't see when you're down in the weeds. You're really moving through the day to day. So it was really a beautiful experience to reread journals, to look at my perspective from close up, the way I'd recorded it, and then to zoom back out and see some of the big pictures and patterns and changes that it's really hard to see when you're just living it for the first time.
Yes, I completely agree. So when you did that, you read your journals and you looked back. What was the constant in you as a person, as a woman, as a mother throughout all those stages of motherhood? Who were you? What did you discover about yourself, perhaps, about the strengths you didn't know you had?
Well, I think that a real constant for me throughout the whole journey was this really desire to live it fully, this deep desire to live it fully, to be as present for it as I possibly could, and to be as open to it, receptive, to be really listening to my child, to be showing up myself in a way that was very alive. Now, that said, that's a lofty ambition, and the realities of motherhood are sometimes we're just getting through the day. And so it's really touching to me to see in the journals these moments of just deep connection, and then the moments when I'm actually just losing it and have lost track of the bigger picture. And to see that this constant thread of you just don't know how things are going to turn out, right? You have one perspective and one thing that you think or are planning, one set of ideas about how your life is going to go or who your child is going to be. And then life goes in some really unexpected turns. And to really see that happen over and over again, and to see what are the things that get us through those moments where it seems like everything's falling apart or what we planned is not working out is kind of a delight to look back and make sense of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially for you, motherhood began completely, it rocked your world. It didn't start the way you planned or anticipated. Can you speak about your first experience a little bit?
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to is the fact that my first child, my daughter Sierra, was stillborn. She died just a couple of days before her due date after a really wonderful and healthy and happy pregnancy. She just stopped moving. And this was 3 days before my due date. And so the tragedy of that and of that experience, of course, was nothing like what I had been hoping for or planning for, and really ripped me apart, and also really took my sense of love and motherhood to a deeper level. I was so glad that I had loved her fully for that short period while she was living inside me. And I really went into my pregnancy and the birth of my son really knowing in a deeper way that there are no guarantees in life for anybody, right? And so that we really want to open to and love the ones we love while they are here.
Yeah, love and loss, they go together, don't they?
Yes, and it's like, love enlarges our heart in a way that the loss can feel even more painful. And yet we would never want to have not loved.
Yeah. Wow. So profound. It's so agree with that. But sometimes we do fear out of that, especially those of us who experienced loss. It could be scary sometimes to even attempt to love because of that fear of losing that person.
Yes, and I think that that's really one of the things that loss can teach us is that we have, we can't control our life and what happens to us in our life, but we have some degree of choice about how we meet both the fortunate and unfortunate events of our life. And there's a way in which, with loss, it can either shut us down and harden us and make us disconnect. That's a natural phase that we might go through. But ultimately, there's a way, if we really turn toward it, I believe that it can tenderize our heart and open us to the vulnerability and preciousness of our human life and to our profound connection with people everywhere who have lost those they loved. And just this real understanding of this universal phenomena and the preciousness and impermanence of our human life.
Yes, I've been thinking lately about impermanence a lot and reading about it. So, what helped you then, if you look back truly, what helped you to get through those tough times throughout your motherhood journey? You also became a single mom at some point, right? Your life completely changed. Then you had your son who was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome and so many different things that you went through. Sometimes I feel like one person, and God gives that person so much for whatever reason. And that was the case for me when I was reading your book. I'm like, no, not again, not another hardship, not another thing in her life. What helped you, would you say, to not lose sight of things? Or perhaps you did lose sight of things and you lost yourself. I don't know. But what was helping you to be more resilient and be alive and carry on?
Yeah, that's a great question, Anna. And I think, first of all, just to really name that, that yes, there were difficult things that happened, which I wrote about, some just heartbreaking loss, and also just really wonderful gifts and opportunities that I've had in my life as well. And so I think that a human life is often a blend of these things. And so to really remember that, and to remember that one of the many gifts that I have had is really wonderful friends and family, people I'm close to. And I think for anyone going through hard times, community and connection and loved ones is so important, to have that sense of being able to be held up. I think having a very strong practice of yoga and meditation gave me a way to nourish myself and tend myself and re-find center and ground through difficult times. And also a perspective on life that life really does include, that it's very rare to have a human life that doesn't include both joy and loss and ups and downs and tremendous pain and great opportunities for connection. And so to remember that this is not just a personal challenge, but that this is actually part of the challenge of being human, and to hold it in that way was helpful for me.
Who would have you been, as I was asking this question yesterday, without yoga, mindfulness, meditation in your life?
Well, I think I have a lot of the tendencies of the type A, stressed out, driven overachiever. And I think that without these tools, I probably, who knows, but that part could have really run rampant and caused me a lot of health and emotional problems. I'm sure I would probably be a very stressed out and anxious being because I think partly why I was so drawn to these tools is that they were so helpful in managing a nervous system that is very sensitive, as many of us have. So, as someone with a sensitive nervous system, a little bit what we used to call high strung, perhaps, I found these practices so helpful in navigating my life.
Mm. Yes. Do you have an active practice currently of yoga and sitting down meditation? What does it look like today?
Yes, I do. I have a very active practice, and it's become so much a part of my life that I almost don't think of it. It's like, well, of course, you get up in the morning and you brush your teeth and you take a shower. For me, it's like that. Of course, I get up in the morning and have some quiet time to start the day where I settle myself, align with my intention for the day, move my body and greet my body, bringing some fluidity and release in, and to be starting the day from that point. So I definitely have a morning practice on a daily basis. And then also I go regularly on retreats where I can do more intensive practice because I also teach meditation and teach mindfulness meditation retreats and with a real focus on embodied practice, integrating mindful yoga and mindful movement so it's a really seamless flow of stillness and movement. And so I both teach those retreats and then also try to go on those retreats as a form of intensive renewal, which is, of course, easier now that my son is off on his own journey for more months of the year.
Yeah. So how does motherhood look like for you now? I can't even imagine having an adult child. What is your relationship with your son? How does it feel to have an adult to adult relationship? Were you prepared for that chapter? How does it feel? I'm looking forward, that's ahead of me.
Yes. And one of the things that was surprising to me, because I actually was expecting it to feel like a more dramatic shift than it actually is. And I think that that's partly because if you're paying attention, you see that there are constant changes of relationship and changes of circumstances going on over the course of a child's life. And you're constantly letting go of who they were and opening to who they are becoming. And so I remember when my son was probably 8 or 9, he was going to watch some video. And I said, "Don't you think that might be a little scary for you?" And he looked at me and he said, "Mom, I think you're confusing me with an earlier version of myself." And you know how that is. We have one image of our child and then suddenly everything changes. And so having him go off to college is just part of that continuum, when the first day of preschool and the first day of kindergarten. And of course, having a high school student is really different from having a 7-year-old in terms of your relationship and the amount of freedom you have or the amount of time you have with them. So having him go off to college, yes, it's a big shift. And I'm fortunate we have a great, close relationship. We're in very good touch by text. We FaceTime on the weekend, and he can, show me around his room and show me where he is. So he feels and it's almost like as a mother, your heart just gets, the geographical reach of your heart just gets larger and larger from those early days when they're sleeping in a bassinet or in your bed or in a co-sleeper right next to you, then to expand to hold the whole house and then the whole town, and then they're off at summer camp somewhere. And now it's just like my sense of the space just is larger. He's on the other side of the country. And
Mm.
I'm fortunate this summer he's back home and he's here. He's working as a camp counselor at a local day camp, as a counselor in an art, science, and creativity camp. And so he goes off to work in the morning, but often comes home at night unless he has plans with his other friends. So, and we have a whole new wonderful kind of relationship. And he's one of my favorite people to spend time with. So I think it's just really part of that whole journey of letting go.
Mm. How about a sense of loss when they enter a new phase developmentally, our children? I feel it myself. My daughter is 11. I feel like it's hard. I can feel she's growing up and going a little far from me, becoming her own person. And I have a little bit of sadness. It's kind of bittersweet, maybe a sense of loss. Did you experience that? Do you think that's real? That's part of the process? Or maybe it's real for some of us who did experience loss in our life in the past, and we sort of have unresolved loss and we bring that into parenting. Um,
Yeah, I think it's really natural because these transformations are so complete and when we have a certain version of our child with us so vividly, and it's hard to imagine when that's going on that they won't always be in diapers, for instance, and then suddenly you realize you've changed your last diaper and that's over. Or whatever it is, you've breastfed for the last time, or suddenly they're no longer sitting in your lap and snuggling, and then suddenly they're bigger than you. Just this whole letting go of the old. But I think what really helps is the really opening to the emerging, and really opening to the delight of that, and really savoring each new version of our child. It's just a natural part of life, and it's part of impermanence. One of my Buddhist teachers, Thich Nhat Hanh, someone asked him about impermanence, and he said, well, without impermanence, how could a grain of corn be planted and grow up to be a whole new ear of corn? And without impermanence, how could your child grow up? He said, instead of fighting impermanence and thinking it's bad, we should say, long live impermanence.
mm,
So to really know that we're part of this dance of life, and things are always changing, and there can be the suffering and holding on to how things used to be. And then also, I know for some parents, sometimes it's a relief when a certain phase ends. They'll go through some phase and you're like, I'm really glad that that's over. And now and then whatever the thing is, that difficult phase ends. But then what I find is that even with that, after it's over and gone, there can be this nostalgia for that. Like someone might have had a really hard time having a tantruming 2-year-old and just be so happy that now they're this easygoing 7-year-old. But you look back at those little pictures of the 2-year-old or the videos, and you realize how darn cute they were and how much you loved them. And you realize that even the difficult phases are composed both of difficult moments and really wonderful, delightful moments.
What phase was difficult for you now that you look back? What was the hardest age? Toddler years, the infancy, teenage years, perhaps?
I would say probably the hardest years for a number of reasons for me were the age, like around what sometimes gets called the terrible twos, sort of the late, 18 months to 3 years period was difficult for me. And as I write in my memoir, in the Mama Sutra, it was not just because of the difficulties of parenting highly sensitive and opinionated 2-year-old. That was also a time when my marriage was falling apart. And so I had a lot of inner turbulence. And a lot of outer change going on, and a child who was not what you would call an easy toddler, although he had, of course, I adored him and he was amazing and wonderful. And he was what they often call a high need child. And so it was a very hard period for me.
Mm. And you write in your book that you always wanted to have many children. At least, no, I think you said you wanted to have a daughter, right? A daughter and a son. And you come from a large family. You're one of 7 children. Do you have regrets looking back in terms of having more children? Not that it's in your control, right?
Yeah. It's hard to use the word regret. One of the things I'm very joyful about, actually, is that in my partnership with my current partner, who I've now been with for 10 years, that he has a daughter. And so that we actually were able together to form a family. And I write this in the book. I have a wonderful relationship with my stepdaughter, and who really came into my life when she was older. She was 19 when I first connected with her. And she's got a wonderful connection with my son, who is about 7 or 8 years younger than she is. And so I've been able to have this experience of the family, especially there was a good stretch of time where she was living with us, and where it would be, the 4 of us all around the dinner table in the evening, which was closer to my memories of my own childhood, where once at Thanksgiving, there was so much food on the table that the table broke. This was an exciting memory from when I was 4. So that feeling of having a larger family was something that I was able to celebrate. And
yeah. In that chapter, that's a beautiful chapter too. Chapter 17, Finding My Daughter. It's titled, and I love a little passage from there. You write, when a child enters your life through a different door, as an adolescent, a teenager, or a young adult, it's harder to know when your story together begins. I just love that part, when your story together begins. Yeah, very sweet. How was it for you? I want to know more about you as a child. I know you were one of 7. You grew up in a Catholic family. I learned this yesterday during our first interview. And you grew up in a military family, and you went to boarding school. Who was young Anne? And what is preserved from that young Anne today or throughout your life when you look at yourself? What are those constant traits or characteristics that always have defined you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you say, I grew up in a big family. I was the youngest, and I was in a military family, which meant that we moved a lot. So every couple of years, in my father's career as an army officer, we would get a new set of orders, and we would be picking up and moving somewhere very different. Sometimes in this country, sometimes in other countries, and so my childhood was marked by a lot of change, a lot of moving from place to place and letting go of people and friends and communities and starting over, often as the new kid in school. And I think that one of the things that remained constant is one of the ways I coped with that was through a very deep imaginative life. So I was a storyteller as a child. I used to love to make up stories and invent stories and tell them to myself, and then got interested in writing at a very early age. And as you can see, I'm still a storyteller. I still love to express teachings and experiences through writing about them and sharing them with others. And that's a way that I make sense of my world. And it's also a creative outlet for me. As you mentioned, I was in boarding school. So that was because my father was stationed in Korea, actually, and my family was over there. And by that point, I was older, and my older brother went back to college while I was there. So I was now the only one left at home from all seven. It's a big 16-year spread of our family siblings. So I was there living in Korea with my mother and my father, who was very consumed with his work there. So going back to boarding school was a way of giving me some stability for the rest of high school, because it looked like it was uncertain where my father would go after that. It looked like I might be at 3 or 4 different schools. So I went back to boarding school in Connecticut for 3 years, which was really the longest that I had ever been in a school anywhere up to that point.
So away from your parents?
Away from my parents, yes.
Wow. How was that experience for you?
Well, I would see them on vacations. It was very exciting for me to go off and to be somewhere and to be feeling like I would be there for a few years. I think the reason that I mentioned that is because, given the academic intensity of that school, and it was also a very strict school, some of that free-form storytelling that I used to do, and that sense of like lots of time for the imaginative life, really got shifted and channeled into a much more academic direction. And later in life, a big part of my spiritual work was reclaiming some of that spontaneity and effortless, non-judgmental creativity of childhood, which got a little bit squelched in the context of an excellent school.
Yeah, I could see that. Like the experience for your mom, having 7 children and moving so much. First, actually, now that you mentioned that you moved a lot and you changed schools and you changed relationships and friends, right? Oftentimes when you move, you have to say goodbye to people and deal with that. No wonder you have this perspective today, at least, about change, impermanence, loss. It's somewhat robust and refreshing, your perspective, I guess. Having gone through those experiences in your childhood maybe made you more adaptable and broadened your perspective and more accepting of those experiences.
Yeah, it might well have done that. And I think what it also did is it meant that when I encountered those teachings, which are so central actually to the teachings of Buddhist practice and yogic practice, meditative practice, which I found when I was in my teenage years, I recognized the truth of them, and it spoke to something that I'd experienced but hadn't heard named. And so I think that was very helpful to me. And then they also gave me a way of finding a sense of rootedness in myself, because I think that one of the downsides of that kind of moving and that kind of always entering a new situation and always being kind of the new kid in the class was that I didn't have a sense of inner rootedness. And there was a way of not ever quite knowing if I fit in or how to fit in that was hard. And so that as an adult, a young adult, when I really came to these practices, they helped me find a sense of rootedness in myself and helped me find a sense of home in myself and in my own body, that sense of being at ease in my own skin that I think had been disrupted by such a childhood that was so on the move, with so many different, so much change and upheaval in it. And also connected me with a really wonderful community of people who, as an adult, I have friendships and connections that I've sustained over many years. And many of them came through these practices.
Yeah, I think you do need time, right, to cultivate not only long-term meaningful relationships, also to get to know you in the context of those relationships. And when you move and shift from school to school, from place to place, that can get compromised. I often see that in our Western American culture, having grown up in a place where I where I lived, I always had the same set of friends, the same classmates, the same neighborhood. Everything was constant, and the neighbors were the same, the kids were the same, the games were the same. And I see a lot of benefit in that. However, living here in the United States, well, I grew up in Armenia, and raising a child here where everybody is moving, even though we were, let's say, in the same building, but everybody left. Then we moved, everything shifts. I see that as a downside for my daughter, but maybe it's not, right? It's my own thinking, because I always feel like, she didn't have a chance to develop a deep relationship with that child. That child moved. I feel pain for my child almost, as if it's a loss in some way, even though perhaps she doesn't view that experience like that. I think it's a chance for you as a person to test those notions of belonging, fitting in, right? You learn so much about yourself when you have enough time in those long-term relationships or in places. I don't know what's right, what's wrong, but as we are discussing, I could see upsides and downsides to both, to the same experience.
Exactly. And I think that's what's really important for us as parents to remember is that, of course, we have this longing. We want to give our children the perfect experience. And just to really let go of that and say, yes, we're going to be imperfect. Their circumstances are going to be imperfect. There will be ups and downs of whatever experience they have. I definitely wanted, having moved around that much, was really happy to be able to give my son a childhood in which he has friends now who he's known since before he could talk.
Mm-hmm.
The ones who we went and used to play with at the playground together, they're still in his life. So that's really wonderful. And then I'm also aware that, yes, there is a downside to having lived in a fairly sheltered community with a particular socioeconomic demographic that is not all that diverse, and that's a downside. And so I think that to really know that what we can most give our children is, our love, our support, and our deep belief in them, our deep listening to them. The circumstances of their life and our life are to some extent out of our control, and to really recognize that and to surrender in some sense, that we're not going to be able, by striving in every way that we can, give them just the absolute perfect experience. And that even in a sense, by protecting them from certain stresses of life, it's through manageable stress with support that they build a kind of strength and resilience. So,
yes.
We don't want to shelter them. We don't want to obsess over sheltering them from everything difficult in life.
Yes. I was working with a client who recently got divorced, and he's raising 2 of his children, and the wife is not in the picture. He was expressing sadness for his children that they do not have a relationship with their mom. And it is what it is, right? I told him, and of course it's hard for people to hear this stuff when they're going through that experience, that this is your child's story. You can't edit, you can't write that for them, but you can be there for them and support them while they're going through that experience. They will grow from that experience. Yes, it could be sad sometimes, but what was your mom experiencing? I'm just curious, what was going through her mind and how hard must have been for her to move with 7 children? I cannot even imagine that.
I really can't either. I mean, it's really hard for me to imagine. And of course, one of the things she said when my son was an infant, and I said, "Mom, how did you do this with 7 children? I can't imagine." And she said, "I worked harder with the first one than I did with all the rest put together." And then she said, and then when you have a few of them, then the older ones help take care of the littler ones, and it gets much easier. So I think that was a big part of her reality, was that my older sisters in particular, because the first four in my family were girls, and the oldest was 15, almost 16 when I was born. My older sisters really took care of me a lot, and they really shared a lot of the workload with my mother. And of course, that became part of their story.
Yes.
Certain strengths to that, certain not so great things around having the usual kind of carefree teen life, or what we might imagine to be the carefree teen life. So I know that when my oldest sister first had a daughter, she would constantly accidentally refer to her daughter by my name. That was where she learned to care for a little baby girl.
Wow. Yeah. And she had a daughter. I wonder what was her experience like having already parented a girl. Sometimes people can be resentful or done with parenting. Of course, stories are different, but it's quite interesting. I find family dynamics and human nature and relationships very intriguing.
Yes, they are. And, one of the things about having a big family is there are lots of these relationships. And I'm fortunate that I have a great connection with my siblings. We see each other a lot and stay in connection with one another. And also the next generation of all of their children. And now there's another generation beyond that. My parents, who both passed away in their 90s in the last few years, they had many, many great grandchildren by the time they passed away. So it's a very big family with many children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren from my parents.
Mm. You mentioned that when you first started learning about Buddhist concepts and teachings, you finally made some connections and you had aha moments, right? You had names for the things that you experienced or you knew intuitively. You had knowings or experiences. I'm curious, what was the first lesson or perhaps first aha moments from those teachings that you remember? What was the biggest one, perhaps, that made an impression on you?
Yeah, I think there were the teachings which I heard, and then there was the experience of practice. And I think it really came together after I'd been hearing teachings and doing practices for several years, but I was still quite young, in my early 20s. And I really felt the unification of the body-mind practices of yoga, yoga postures and breath, with the mind training and heart training practices of Buddhism, and felt them come together in a way that I had a lived experience of a kind of happiness that was not dependent upon outside circumstances. In other words, I could come into a practice session with being in one frame of mind and leave in a dramatically different frame of mind and heart. Nothing in my external life would have shifted, but the inner energetics of my body mind and my attitude would have shifted, and that would make a tremendous difference. And I think that was so powerful for me to experience and really get. Of course, we're affected by circumstances. I don't mean to say that we're going to be this total blissed out being and anything can happen and we won't notice. Terrible things happen and we will grieve, and there are terrible things happening in the world and assaults on all kinds of groups of people that need to be changed and addressed. So it's not about detaching from the world and just having a detached kind of bliss state. That said, within any set of circumstances, we often have a certain range of flexibility around how we might feel in the midst of that. And to really get that experience was powerful for me.
May I share something with you of my recent experience with that?
Yes.
So I recently went to a yoga class. Somebody gave me a guest pass to this new yoga place. And one day I just decided to go to this class out of a blue. I had free time. Before I got to the yoga place, I received a phone call, a very disturbing, alarming, very anxiety provoking phone call. And I got really bad news. And I was shaken, and I stood there before entering the class thinking, why am I here? I don't want to go to this class. I'd rather deal with this matter. And I was shaking. It was very, very stressful. Nevertheless, I hung up the phone, and since I was there, I just went into the class without knowing what kind of class I am entering into. The woman looked at me and said, "Oh, welcome. This is a restorative yoga class. Have you taken this type of class before?" I said, "No." She said, "Oh," and she explained what to expect, restorative yoga. And I said, "You know what? I could use this in my life. Why not? I'm here. I might as well." There were lots of blankets and props and heavy sand things that you put on your body, and darkness and music and everything. And the moment we did the first pause, and in the breathing, she guided us into this breathing, I felt my anxiety bubble up so much that I just wanted to rip everything off of me and get up and run away. Like I almost felt like a panic attack. And I'm not exaggerating. I felt that kind of panic attack before in my life when they were taking me into a C-section, when I was tied to the operating table, and the same type of panic attack. And I reminded myself, I said, "You know what, Anna, just be with this anxiety, see what's underneath, all this stuff that we talk about on the podcast, and feel your feelings." Even though it was painful, I convinced myself to remain in that class. And as the time went on, it was an hour and a half class. As I breathed and did the poses and everything, I felt my anxiety was no longer almost there at some point. It was very mild, and I was happy I remained there. And then towards the end, something very unexpected and shocking happened. She announced that she's going to do some Reiki, that are we okay if she put her hand on our body and do some energy work? And I said yes. When she placed her hands on my back gently, whatever she was doing, I started having this vision of a big open field with poppy flowers and lots of butterflies. And I saw myself as a 6-year-old little girl. I'm still imagining this as I'm telling this story, with, dark hair, short hair, running and chasing happily, chasing butterflies. And I was so happy, and there was such warmth in that image. And I heard my mother's voice calling my name and being happy with me. And, I lost my mom when I was 13. And I never see her in my dreams or anything. And just that moment, having gone through that experience, it was so profound. I started crying, and I allowed myself to cry in that yoga practice. And she saw that. When the practice was over, she came and she said, "Would you like to share what happened and what you went through?" And so I did. And now I completely understand what you're talking about. It was very powerful.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Anna. And I'm so sorry to hear that you had that loss of your mother so young. And I'm so glad that the yoga practice opened this door in you to that kind of feeling of release and connection.
Yes, I guess that relaxation, the anxiety. And at the time I was reading a book, Motherless Daughters. Maybe it all comes together. And when you are super relaxed and you allow yourself to be present, and, when things surface, I guess when you allow those things to surface and be with them, it could be very transformative.
Yes, absolutely. And you come into a different kind of relationship with the experiences of your life. And that's a perfect example. You could have just been stressed and rattled and just said, "I'm too busy and stressed to go to yoga." And, your day could have unfolded in a very different direction. And so that sense of opening up the space in our lives to feel below the busyness and the surface and to connect with a deeper level of our hearts is a really powerful thing that can shift our whole relationship to our life and to other people and to our journey as parents.
Yes. What experiences did you have perhaps that are very powerful or unexpected or in some ways transformative for you in terms of meditation, retreats, yoga?
I'm looking back at the arc of a lifetime here, really, because I've been practicing for so many decades in these traditions. And I would say that it's a combination for me of the kind of experience that you're mentioning, which are like transformative experiences where you really hit some depth in the course of a practice or in the course of a yoga or a meditation practice. And then there's what you do with that in terms of the shift in the life. So I would say it's hard for me to pull out one experience. There's a temptation to say, oh, well, I was sitting here and I had that insight. But what I've learned and what I say to people is the experiences are one thing, but if you don't then take them into your life away from the retreat or away from the cushion or away from the mat and change them, they'll remain just that. They will remain an experience and they'll be very beautiful. It'll be a story that I might tell. But the main thing is then coming back and like, what are the shifts that we might make? For instance, so I'll give just a very, just because it's a recent one. I had an experience on a retreat I went on recently, which was a wilderness retreat. So I'd had a very, very busy, can imagine with the book coming out this spring. And then also I have a very full life as the director of mentoring for a mindfulness teacher training and many, many students that I was seeing as a training was getting launched this spring. So all very wonderful work, but a lot of time on the computer and a lot of Zoom sessions and, emails and that kind of thing. So I went off on this retreat into the wilderness and it was a silent meditation retreat on a stretch of remote land. We backpacked 9 miles to get in there and I was spending a lot of time meditating, looking at the ocean, looking at the waves, sleeping at night in a tent, feeling that and feeling the reattunement with nature that comes from that, the letting go of it was completely off the grid. So no email, no cell phone, no texting, and really feeling in my nervous system how much that was needed and feeling that deep reconnection with the elements and the body and the sea. So wonderful. That's a beautiful, deep realization. It's so easy to then come back from that and just have that disappear into the busyness of life. So one of the commitments I made to myself on that retreat was I was going to open up more space in my life for that. And that involved making a couple of difficult decisions about saying no to some things that would have been on my calendar that were wonderful and that I wanted to do, but that I more needed the space than I needed to do those things. So that's an example of the kind of integration between the experience that we might have and then the taking it into an action that will create actual change in the life long term.
Yes, I agree. If you were to go back in time, knowing what you know about mindfulness, meditation, motherhood, what would you say to yourself as a new mom?
I would say it's all going to work out all right. Relax and enjoy these precious moments. Relax and enjoy these precious moments because they are fleeting. They are changing, and enjoy every moment with your little one. Really savor it.
What inspires you?
What inspires me? Can you say a little more about the question?
In general, what inspires you as a person? Where do you draw inspiration in terms of life?
Yeah, I draw inspiration from people who I see really manifesting in the world in beautiful and courageous ways these values of love and compassion and kindness. I am inspired by people stepping up and speaking out against assaults on the environment and assaults on vulnerable populations. I draw inspiration from people who are able to manifest their love and kindness in really extraordinary, difficult circumstances.
Mm. Thank you so much, Anne, for your time, your presence, your authenticity, your book, your work in the world. It's been truly a joy connecting and getting to know you and reading your memoir. It's been truly an honor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's been really wonderful talking with you as well.
And that's it for this episode of the Authentic Parenting Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. As always, I would love to hear your takeaways from this episode. Let's continue the conversation in our private Facebook group. You can follow me on Instagram to see what I'm up to, and I post a lot of personal things almost daily. I recently recorded my trip to Omega Institute, and it was quite interesting to keep up with posting daily about my experiences. My username is authentic.parenting.podcast. For show notes, contact info, and everything else, as always, visit authenticparenting.com. Next week, we have the monthly special episode with Laura Froen, where we get to answer your parenting questions. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the podcast, and you will never miss a new episode. And of course, I'd appreciate if you can rate and review it on Apple Podcasts. And as always, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. Until next week, I am Anna Seawold. Thank you so much for listening.